All right. Good morning, good afternoon. We are continuing ahead with some class notes today from time period four, mostly corresponding guys with chapters 8 and 9 from your AMSCO textbook on Google Drive there. So we're going to open up talking about the economy and economic expansion, um, how the different economies between the North and the South and the economic expansion moving westward impacts American politics, with particular regard getting into the notion of slavery, which is, of course, is a divisive aspect of these northern and southern economies. So all of this against the backdrop, right, of the Industrial Revolution, which had already kind of taken foot in Great Britain, didn't really spread to the United States until the early 1800s, in large part because the United States at this point was very much the agrarian nation that Thomas Jefferson was after, right? There was a lot of land, and so a lot of farmers farming that land. Labor was fairly scarce, on the other hand, until we get towards the tail end of time period for the 1840s. We see a significant rise in immigration and therefore in cheap labor sources, a trend that will continue moving forward. But generally speaking, the money and the resources weren't quite as available in America as they had been in mainland Europe, right, and in Great Britain, so that the Industrial Revolution was slow to take foot. Although when it took foot, it was significant. And one of those contributing factors, of course, was the cotton gin. Cotton had long been the premier agricultural product for export from the United States. Um, the embargo and the War of 1812 forced American domestic manufacturing production to really step up, and the textile industry in particular grew very well and very rapidly. But with that comes a demand for Southern cotton. And the invention of the cotton gin makes that production cheap and profitable. And ironically, as we'll see, makes the Southern economy even more dependent upon slave labor. You would think now that we have kind of an automated process that might not be the case, but that automated process is largely offset, of course, by the exponential increase in demand as the textile industry advances. So the Southern economy, again, becomes more and more slavery dependent. Um, we see the advent of what we would call king cotton in the South, okay, following the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793, and the increasing usage of the cotton gin throughout the early to mid 1800s. Um, and we know, again, that demand uh, throughout the agrarian South, if you will, okay, um, is promoted by the economy in the increasingly industrial North. And what we call that kind of the seeds for those differences had been placed long ago, right, in just the way that the early colonies had formed, the early cities had formed, largely due, if you will recall, to kind of the geographical differences, be it climate or type of soil. But the division of these types of economies was kind of the writing had been on the wall for some time, and it only increases during the 1800s here. Um, we see advents like, again, the cotton gin, but also interchangeable parts, meaning that the United States and its northern cities in particular is able to become even more robust in its manufacturing. Small farms still exist, sure, but we see the firearm industry, we see the textile industry in particular, and we're going to see a number of other industries set to explode here based upon the system that is put in place when interchangeable parts come in, right? This is kind of the birth, if you will, of the assembly line. So what we're witnessing is a widening in the disparate growth and the diversity of economic activities between the North and the South in the United States. That itself is up against a backdrop, of course, of American expansionism. Okay. And we'll start talking about Florida, which is kind of the lone holdout, right, of Spanish control. Um, the panhandle of Florida had long been kind of grabbed by American settlers in the early 1800s, but the peninsula itself is still under Spanish control. In 1818, a forceful military leader, General Andrew Jackson, um, enters Florida. He says he's going to secure the border against Indians and fugitive slaves, and ends up capturing important Spanish posts and essentially overthrows the Spanish governor. Um, the United States had signed a treaty under Secretary of State John Q. Adams to demand concessions from Spain. This is the Adams-Onis Treaty, which cedes control of Florida from the Spanish to the United States. Um, as a part of that treaty, the United States promises that we are never going to take Texas. So wait a couple class periods and, well, we take Texas. Spoiler alert. A large part of that expansionism is also centered around, of course, moving west, and that's probably really the major story here beyond the acquisition, if you will, of Florida. So money for Americans is really to be found in land, especially in the South, where we're talking primarily, again, about an agrarian and agricultural based economy. Um, so the settlers had been pushing for some time, right? Beyond the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River and continuing to push westward. And we're getting into this theme we're going to dive into pretty heavy soon enough, this notion of manifest destiny, right? That westward movement will soon incorporate America from sea to shining sea. It's a very difficult life out on the frontier, as it were. And Americans proved certainly to be tough, rugged individualists. And this brings about the American ethos, if you will, or this notion, this ideal of self reliance, of rugged individualism, that is still really kind of in the American spirit today. Okay. Um, really importantly, right, as we're looking at these emerging, I shouldn't say emerging, right, continued differences, only getting more and more stark between the northern economy and the southern economy as America pushes westward. Um, we're going to see this divide play out, right, between the agrarian South and the industrial North as it relates to slavery. Um, and we're going to get to the first of kind of a series of compromises that I would frame essentially as kind of kicking the can down the road uh, as America heads towards a civil war. In 1819, Missouri applies for admission as a state. Um, it's a slave territory. Slavery is well established there, but a lot of people in Congress want to restrict slavery. Okay, and in 1819, it just so happens there are 11 free states in the North and 11 slave states in the South. It's about this same time, right, that Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts, applies for statehood itself. So the two states join together, and there's a balance of power where there's essentially 12 slave states and 12 free states, as it were, as they're called. And in making that deal, okay, there's a proposal to ban slavery north of the 36-degree, 30-minute parallel. That is that line of latitude at 36 degrees and 30 minutes, which is a measure between degrees, right? Um, that is essentially the southern border of Missouri. And the bill passes, and so both states, Missouri and Maine, become members of the Union at the same time. And both sides are happy. But again, it just kind of delays the inevitable that we're looking at a series of compromises beginning here on an incredibly contentious issue, which ultimately will become the, make no mistake about it, cause for civil war. So on a map here, you can see here's Jefferson's free real estate, 1803 Louisiana Purchase. And as America pushes westward and politicizes those borders, you'll see kind of some of that territory remaining unorganized. But here, Missouri is admitted as a slave state, and you'll see the 36-30-degree line there. So what they're saying essentially, right, is that any new territories moving westward north of that line were to be free, in other words, were to be closed to slavery. And territories such as the Arkansas Territory, marked here on this map, are kind of open to the notion of slavery as America continues her westward expansion. Big picture, okay, as you can imagine, with these divisions taking place, north, south, slavery, regional economies, what have you, um, political parties are forming and reforming, and essentially we're going to come up to a new set of political parties. The Federalists, you will recall, essentially just are not around anymore, right? They had largely been restricted to the New England region anyway, and were largely seen as weak, if you will recall, in the wake of their beliefs about America's inability to be successful in the War of 1812. So then we got to the era of good feelings, right? The Jeffersonian Republicans had become the Democratic Republicans, and it was essentially just that party throughout the tenure of James Monroe and the era of good feelings. But by about this time, about 1828, there seems to be factions emerging. You'll recall that's a word that James Madison himself used in the Federalist Papers, right, to describe essentially what amounts to political parties. Factions being the great fear of what could one day undo democracy if not kept in check. The factions that are emerging at this time are the National Republicans, the figurehead being John Quincy Adams, right, a former Federalist, and what will become to be known simply as the Democratic Party, the figurehead, of course, being General and later President Andrew Jackson. So this is kind of to paint the political picture for you, okay? And so by this point, the Republicans, the National Republicans, would tend to be that party in the North, okay? And the Democrats would tend to be that party in the South. Andrew Jackson is a Southerner himself. Um, John Quincy Adams, that leader of the National Republicans or the Republican Party, okay, is going to become president, like his father and like his father, a one-term president. Let's talk about how he got there because it's a pretty fascinating story. It's known as the corrupt bargain. The presidential election of 1824 features, of course, Andrew Jackson, a Democrat, John Quincy Adams as a Republican, and then you've got a couple other guys in there, William Crawford, Henry Clay, and in the Electoral College, no candidate has what they call an absolute electoral vote majority. So the decision, as it would in these cases per the Constitution, goes to the House of Representatives. Now, at this point, what happens, by the way, not necessarily as related to this slide as to kind of understanding. When an election goes to the House of Representatives, and this is relevant because there was talk about whether or not this would happen in the 2020 election, right? And you would think, well, the Democrats hold a majority in the House, so they would have elected Biden, but it doesn't work that way. In the House of Representatives, each state delegation gets the equivalent of a single vote. Okay. And so, whatever political party holds more states in the House of Representatives would hold the power in that runoff of a presidential election, if you will. A very rare thing that happens, though it has happened a couple times, including here in 1824. What happens in 1824 that's even more interesting, okay, is that Henry Clay was ineligible to be considered for president at this point, but he is the Speaker of the House. And it turns out that John Quincy Adams wins the House of Representatives election and becomes the next president. He immediately turns around and names Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. And so Jackson's supporters are enraged. They call fraud. They call fake news. They call all these other things. There are a number of. It's fascinating, actually. You'll probably hear me kind of make not so subtle references to how I think there are incredible political similarities between Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. But so Jackson's supporters call this the corrupt bargain. They say that, hey, the only reason that JQA won the election is he cut a deal with Henry Clay. If Henry Clay could round up those votes in the House, that Jackson would name him as Secretary of State. That could be what happened, but regardless, that is the net effect. When JQA becomes president, again, a national Republican, he's seen as kind of a nationalist. He supports a lot of federal programs. Remember, he's the son of the great Federalist John Adams. He was, prior to becoming a Republican, was a Federalist, right? And so Federalists had always kind of grounded themselves in the belief of a strong, even if arguably too strong or overreaching federal government. So he supports naturally federal funds for roads, for canals, for all sorts of federal spending. But a lot of the country seems to be moving towards this notion of sectionalism, of states' rights, of the ideals and principles we had come to know belonging to Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party, or prior to that, the Anti-Federalists. JQA fails to gain a lot of support, popular support for his agenda. You can make the argument that a large part of that is because he's kind of tainted by the corrupt bargain that put him into office, and also that he's the first minority president. Obviously, he's white. We don't mean that kind of minority, but in terms of not having gained a majority of votes, John Quincy Adams' presidency is largely like his father's, kind of doomed from the beginning. He's seen as somewhat illegitimate, or at least not a favored, strong, popular candidate coming in with a clear kind of moral conviction provided to him by the people to get his work done. So he runs for re-election in 1828, and he squares off against Andrew Jackson. This time, though, Jackson's able to put it together. He absolutely dominates JQA in the election of 1828 in what is a particularly nasty, nasty election. It's probably the first of what we would think of as a modern political election, with some incredible mudslinging, insults, lies, slanders. Again, I can draw a parallel, right, to Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. Adams' camp was not innocent at all himself. Had pointed out that Jackson's wife had not yet been fully divorced from her first husband, and so, well, he literally calls her a two-timing whore. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson's camp starts vicious rumors, fake news, that John Quincy Adams pimped out underage girls to foreign dignitaries. So yeah, the election of 1828 is seen as modern in the sense of its mudslinging and its nastiness. And I would suggest there are some corollaries that we can draw to modern politics. I would like you at home to pause for a second and click on this link. It's a brief and entertaining video, I think, or at least if it's not that entertaining, it's only a couple minutes long, talking about the nasty election of 1828. So that brings us right to Andrew Jackson as president. Andrew Jackson is going to oversee the nation during an age of expansion, during some efforts at reform, although maybe some that he caused in need of himself, and essentially the age of Andrew Jackson. John C. Calhoun is his president. And he's an interesting dude that we're going to dive into at least just a little bit here. But there's a lot going on during Andrew Jackson's presidency. Let's talk about it. Jackson is seen as the common man. Okay, I mentioned before, kind of he's a Southerner. Um, he he didn't, he's seen as a common that he's not wealthy, he's not from the East, he's not this Federalist type character. He was, on the DL, he was actually fairly wealthy, but he didn't publish that fact. He enjoyed the reputation of being a common man, a man of the people during his campaigning. Of course, um, he had a history as a military hero. When Jackson comes into office, it's seen, and his supporters would claim, it's this new era of democracy. It's an age of the common man. You can make an argument that there's kind of a populist element to Andrew Jackson when he comes into office. And originally, some voting rights begin to expand. Um, first to all kind of land owning white males, and then to all white males. And at this point, okay, that's about as democratic as it gets, to remove the land ownership restriction among who can vote. And so this is another kind of feather in the cap of Andrew Jackson claiming to be of the common man. I think, like Trump, Jackson puts into place what we would call the spoils system, where a lot of his political supporters are put into federal positions. This is a practice that clearly remains. It's largely reformed later in American history when we move kind of a lot of civil service positions into merit-based systems, and you guys will talk a little bit more about that in AP Gov. But the spoil system is first kind of really seen to have taken off during Andrew Jackson's presidency. One of the things, of course, that Jackson is most notable for, sadly, is the policy of Indian removal. Jackson was absolutely, historians will tell you, an unabashed racist. He sees, at best, he sees the Indians as a nuisance who stand in the way of the progress of the white man, of America's moving forward, as it were, and moving westward. And they needed to be pushed further westward, at least west of the Mississippi River now. And while he's president in 1830, Congress passes, early in his presidency, right? Congress passes the Indian Removal Act, which forces Native Americans to give up their land and move to what had been marked as Indian territory in present day Oklahoma. Now, this gets really interesting because here is Jackson, right, a Democrat that, and in the South, and a common man, not in line with kind of Federalist Party thinking, or the Republicans as they are now. Um, and But he's so hell bent on this policy, based in large part on his racism, that the Indians are standing in the way of white progress. Um, that there are a couple Supreme Court cases that Jackson just flat out ignores, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. But the two most notable cases are the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia and Worcester v. Georgia, where as the state of Georgia seeks to control tribal matters, the Cherokee Nation sues. There had previously been a treaty that we'll see talked about in this next video. And the state of Georgia and the federal government, for that matter, is in violation of that treaty. And the Supreme Court, this is still the John Marshall Court, right, as the Chief Justice, rules in favor of the Indian tribes, in favor in particular of the Cherokee Nation. And again, Jackson just flat out ignores the ruling. Okay. Um, he is quoted at one point. We'll take a look at a cartoon here in a couple of days, where he says something to the effect of, hey, Chief Justice Marshall has made his ruling. Now let him try to enforce it. Well, as we know, when we talked about kind of the principles and foundations of American government, the Supreme Court is designed to be the final arbiter of what is or is not constitutional. And that's supposed to be, the Constitution is supposed to be the final law of the land. And Jackson just flat out ignores the ruling and directs the military to force these 5 civilized tribes, okay, including the Cherokee, out of their lands along what becomes known as the Trail of Tears, and out towards Oklahoma. And this depiction, I'm sure, I hope you have seen before, of the Trail of Tears, is intended to depict what kind of brutality took place, and the death and from disease and exhaustion that were perpetuated upon the Cherokee here. I have linked for you on this picture, for those of you at home, another video talking a little bit more about the Trail of Tears, and it makes reference to the treaty which had been violated, that the Supreme Court recognized, and of course, which Andrew Jackson just flat out ignores. So Jackson's racist removal of the Indians along the Trail of Tears may be one of the things he is most well remembered for, though not well remembered for. Some of the other things that, of course, Jackson will be known for is his policies surrounding the National Bank. And it's pure irony that Andrew Jackson currently sits as the face on the $20 bill, when it's known that he really worked hard to take down the Bank of the United States, which he despised. And here we get into a little bit more of kind of some of the groundwork set up that's going to cause further division between the North and the South, and political divisions when we talk about the Tariff of Abominations, and so on and so forth. So let's talk about it. The Tariff of Abominations, remember, in 1816, to essentially pay for and protect the American economy from the War of 1812, Congress had passed a tariff in support of Henry Clay's American system, right? That we would have all sorts of investment in federal infrastructure. This, of course, is later supported by JQA. But this is a tariff, remember, from that last lesson, is intended to protect American manufacturers, right, from foreign competition. That's what it does. A tariff raises taxes on imported products, therefore kind of falsely kind of inflating those prices, and therefore protecting American manufacturers, that they can charge kind of inflated prices of their own because they're not left to compete with imports. Okay. This tariff is raised in 1824. It's raised in 1828. And who hates it? Well, the consumers hate it, right? Because the consumers are forced to pay, in their mind, artificially inflated prices. They could get themselves as consumers a better deal if there were more of a free market. So a lot of those consumers, especially in the South, because that's not where the manufacturers are, right? The manufacturers are up north. As we talk about this kind of sectionalized economy, call these raising of the tariffs, or the reestablishment of the tariff of abominations. Okay, that they have to pay artificially inflated prices, on these manufactured goods. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting from a political standpoint, right? John C. Calhoun, all right, is Jackson's vice president. Calhoun is from South Carolina, and he's a strong opponent of the tariff. Um, South Carolina's economy is in shambles, and many of them, including Calhoun, believes it's in large part because of the tariff. Now, this is going to become a central divide in American politics. Okay, but first, can we just appreciate, please, the face of John C. Calhoun? That is just one beautiful, beautiful man right there, is he not? Okay. So Calhoun develops this theory of nullification. He writes about it, what's known as the South Carolina Exposition. In response to the tariff issue, he says that because the states had essentially created the federal government, they have the final authority over the constitutionality of federal laws. So that if a state believes the federal government had passed an unconstitutional law, then a state can nullify it within that state. We have been down this road before. This is the age old, right? Federal government, federalists, states' rights, Democratic Republicans argument. We go back to Thomas Jefferson secretly authoring the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and we knew then and we know now it doesn't work that way. Okay. The federal government will always reign supreme. And if anyone is to have anything to say about the constitutionality of a federal law, I hope you just said to yourself, it's the Supreme Court, right? The idea is very popular in South Carolina. That's going to come up, right? Because South Carolina is going to be the first state to secede from the Union. And that notion of kind of states' rights, the notion of the idea of secession had been birthed in South Carolina. Calhoun believes that it is a state's rights, among state rights, to secede, never mind to declare other actions of the government unconstitutional. Certainly, we know it doesn't work that way, but that's kind of, there's that word again, the zeitgeist, right, within the political climate of South Carolina. The tariff provokes incredible debate among senators back in Washington, D.C. And there's Robert Hayne, a senator from South Carolina, and Daniel Webster, who argue back and forth on the floor of the Senate. Now, Daniel Webster, I would just take a note. Maybe you read it, Devil and Daniel Webster, in one of your English lit classes at some point. Daniel Webster is known for being such a great barrister, such a great lawyer, that he, in a short story known as The Devil and Daniel Webster, takes on representing a man who had sold his soul to the devil. And he's got to go to court, and he's got to argue against the forked-tongued devil himself. But Webster is so good that he wins the case and frees the man's soul. But these are the two men arguing, right? Daniel Webster and, of course, Hayne, notably from South Carolina. Hayne, of course, is arguing for states' rights. Webster is arguing for federal union. Okay. And Andrew Jackson, the president, of course, sides with Daniel Webster. right? Now, Daniel Webster is from Massachusetts. Daniel Webster is a Republican, right? Daniel Webster is of a different political incline than Andrew Jackson, okay? And typically, Andrew Jackson's vice president. Like they would kind of be somewhat on the same page here. All right. But again, this is where it gets interesting politically. So Jackson sides with Webster naturally in favor of the federal government that he's overseeing. And Andrew Jackson, or sorry, John C. Calhoun, of course, does not. So Calhoun resigns as vice president in 1832. Another tariff is approved again in 1832. The South Carolina legislature, they go ahead and they vote to nullify those laws. Jackson calls it treason and proposes something known as the Force Bill that would use federal troops against the state of South Carolina. Henry Clay, who we will come to know as the Great Compromiser, comes in and, well, he offers a compromise, and South Carolina backs down. But the lesson here isn't that, you can't do that from South Carolina. The lesson that South Carolina takes is that, and John C. Calhoun takes from here, is that no state can challenge the federal government alone. Okay. And so it's this notion of kind of nullification that is going to plant kind of the early political seeds for how the South feels about their own union with respect to the notion of states' rights and secession. Okay. That's the background. I think I will belabor the point when we ultimately get to the Civil War that there is, at that point, it's not about, tariffs. When we get to the Civil War, there is no other states' rights issue in, the late 1850s and into the 1860s. That's, beyond slavery. That's the name of the game then. Okay. But the political seeds are kind of planted here. So Jackson wins re-election, I should say, in 1832. And what does he do? He kills the bank. Again, it's irony that he's on the $20 bill. The central issue in the election of 1832 is what we would call the bank wars. Right? Jackson had vetoed the Bank of the United States recharter bill, and it makes that the major issue of whether or not the federal bank would be rechartered. Jackson thinks the bank has too much control over the finances. We talk about Henry Clay again, and the bank's president, Nicholas Biddle. They fight to see it survive. Those are the central figures, Jackson and Henry Clay, in this bank war, and Jackson wins re-election. So if we're talking about, guys, essentially a single campaign issue election, all right, when there is a victory in that election, it is seen as a mandate to win and implement that single policy. And so when Jackson wins re-election in 1832, largely an election that's centered just around these bank wars, it becomes apparent that this bank is going to die, and certainly enough, along comes along the charter expires in 1836, and it is not renewed. By this point, Jackson's out of tenure in the office. He had served his 2 terms. He had created many enemies over the years. We can talk more about King Jackson and some of our analysis. His ignoring of the Supreme Court in the Trail of Tears, just kind of his political demeanor. And so Jackson's enemies are eventually going to coalesce, right, to form what would become the Whig Party. So we're going to get to kind of another evolution of political parties in America. Jackson had all sorts of, self-inflicted wounds as a result of his war on the Bank of the United States. In order to kind of kill that charter during his second term between 32 and 36, he had removed multiple issuances of funds, federal deposits from the bank. And so certainly it became clear that the bank was going to die. He had the mandate to kill it, it would seem, from the election of 1832. And certainly enough, he began imposing those policies to make it happen. Okay. Um, and so we have this kind of, as I said, a self inflicted wound where there's kind of going to be a lack of regulation over public credit. And so we're going to be left with kind of a hodgepodge of private banks trying to manage, if you will, the nation's finances. And a lot of private banks begin to issue their own paper money, oftentimes backed by gold, what we would say a hard money or a specie. And if they're not backed, or if the specie is in low supply, this paper money is very unreliable. So again, it's a self-inflicted wound where Jackson's revocation of the Bank of the United States leaves the economy in a little bit of some shambles. Jackson issues a decree that a specie circular that all public lands must be bought with hard or metallic money like gold or silver coins. Now, this is going to create a problem, right? Because that kind of money is not accessible to all Americans or even many Americans. There's kind of an irony here uh, that who this would hurt the most are the common man that Jackson intended to represent when he came in during this era of Jacksonian democracy, when he knocked JQA off back in 1828. And what eventually this is going to lead to here, because all this takes place right towards the latter half of Jackson's second term in office, which is going to expire in 1836, is what we're going to come to know as the Panic of 1837, where we're going to see this shortage of ability for average Americans to gain access to a stable bank and sources of loans and that sort of thing, and inability to purchase land, which again is largely kind of the definition of wealth and status in America. It's going to become a major problem when Jackson kills the bank and ushers in this financial panic. And I'm going to close class for you here with another quick little video talking about the Panic of 1837, and we're going to come back to that here in another couple days. But we've done a 30,000 feet kind of walkthrough of Andrew Jackson as president today. We're going to dive in a little bit further to some of the criticisms, quite frankly, of Andrew Jackson during our next class. Okay. There's a lot to say on him. He is absolutely a fascinating character. We're going to watch in our next class a little video. We're going to conduct some document analysis. One way or another, we'll get some positive and some negative appreciation for Andrew Jackson, okay? Because he is a fascinating dude, if nothing else. Having said that, we're going to get into our project soon enough for time period 4 with our mixtape project that I think you're going to have a lot of fun with, where you're going to take kind of an overview of time period 4 and try to see if you can draw some relations, some corollaries to any genre of music and any songs that you could possibly think of. So more on that coming up. Please remember to get into the meat of the academic work here during time period 4. We're going through our AMSCO chapters, okay? And so I've asked you, please, you should be done reading chapter 7 by now. Please finish reading chapter 8 by now. Add chapter 9 to your reading list and begin to preview or pre-read chapter 10 out of your AMSCO. It's dense information, but I think it's much more manageable than our American pageant textbook. And it allows us to cover so much that is happening here during time period 4. Okay. So guys, that is all we got for today. I look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks a lot. Take care.